And a friend of mine, a rabbi, David Wolpe, wrote a beautiful prayer just when everything started happening, and I thought it would be nice to share. Let me find it here. Hold on one second. I got to pull it up.
While you're pulling that up,
Yeah.
I thought that we have a prayer in our Mishkan Tefillah, and here it is: prayer for the state of Israel. And I will start this, Rabbi Mafik, and then we'll get Rabbi Wolpe's prayer. Shalu Shalom Yerushalayim Yishlau Ohavayich. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you prosper. Avinu Shabbat Shemayim. O Heavenly One, protector and redeemer of Israel, bless the state of Israel, which marks the dawning of hope for all who seek peace. Shield it beneath the wings of your love, spread over it the canopy of your peace. Send your light and truth to all who lead and advise, guiding them with your good counsel. Establish peace in the land and fullness of joy for all who dwell there. And we say, Amen.
Amen.
Rabbi, go ahead.
El Malei Rachamim, compassionate God, we pray not to wipe out haters, but to banish hatred, not to destroy sinners, but to lessen sin. Our prayers are not for a perfect world, but a better one, where parents are not bereaved by the savagery of sudden attacks, or children orphaned by blades glinting in a noonday sun. Help us, dear God, to have the courage to remain strong, to stand fast. Spread your light on the dark hearts of the slayers and your comfort to the bereaved hearts of families of the slain. Let calm return to your city, Jerusalem, and to Israel, your blessed land. We grieve with those wounded in body and spirit. Pray for the fortitude of our sisters and brothers, and ask you to awaken the world to our struggles and help us bring peace. Amen.
Amen. I think with no further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Thank you, Rabbi Mafik, and we will, Rabbi Mafik will be here through the week. If you want to talk to him, please call the office. All the clergy, myself, the staff, if there's anything you want to talk about this week, please let us know. We do not have Richard Green, the bureau chief of CNN in Jerusalem. I'm sure he is. I do want to tell you his parents, who are members of Solel, Alan and Carol Green, he is safe. He did in the middle of the night email me, and I hope we'll have him as things calm down. But we do have Carl Schrag. Carl, dear friend, and I've worked with him at the Eye Center. He came to the field of Israel education via his first career in Israeli journalism. During nearly 15 years living in Israel, he reported on some of the biggest and smallest stories unfolding in the country after climbing the ladder at the Jerusalem Post, the English newspaper in Israel. He served as the paper's editor before opting to apply the lens of journalism to help North American learners of all ages engage with Israel in multifaceted ways. When he's not collaborating with the Eye Center colleagues to build the field of Israel education, he can be found teaching current events classes, making jam, hosting family and friends, and spending quality time with his grandson. And he has 3 fantastic boys who grew up with my kids, and I am just so happy to introduce you, Carl, and we can't wait to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that lovely introduction. I was saying to Vanessa before all of you joined this morning that I would say it was my pleasure to step in this morning, but it really isn't my pleasure. What would have been my pleasure is if I didn't know this event was happening and you had a fascinating hour of conversation with Richard Allen Green talking about judicial reform, internal divisions in Israel, prospects for normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and all of the other hot topics of the day, if you're talking about Thursday or Friday of last week, all of which have totally faded into the background in the reality of what's unfolded over the last 32 or so hours in Israel as Hamas launched a surprise attack of a ferocity and a scope and a degree of sophistication that literally nobody saw coming. Throughout the last couple of weeks, I've been following with great interest a lot of the coverage of the impending 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which of course broke out on Yom Kippur 50 years ago. On the English calendar, that was October 6th of 1973, meaning Friday, this past Friday, exactly 50 years. And depending on how you look at things, for some people, it seemed like Israel's been obsessing over this anniversary for months. And for a lot of other people, it seemed like, wow, it's just kind of passing almost unnoticed. There were even radio programs in Israel that on Friday at 2 p.m., the moment that is ascribed as the moment the war broke out on Yom Kippur Day, at 2 p.m. or a couple of minutes after 2, the radio hosts looked at each other and said, oh, I guess we missed the exact anniversary. But on the other hand, there were programs and there were articles and there were forums all over Israel looking at the 1973 Yom Kippur War. So we're not here to talk about the Yom Kippur War, but I do want to use it as our jumping off point to explore and try to understand with a little bit of nuance and a little bit of unpacking what's going on right now and how and in what ways that is significant. So the Yom Kippur War literally caught Israel unaware. The military intelligence assessments were at late September, early October of 1973. There is literally no way that any Arab country is going to attack. They're all still licking their wounds from the Six-Day War 6 years prior. There is literally no chance of war breaking out. And of course, military intelligence and other security units, their full-time job is to assess risk. So Yom Kippur is approaching in 1973, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. And in the IDF Manpower Division, they decided that they were going to let most soldiers go home to be with their families for the holiday, leaving just a few tanks staffed up on the Golan Heights, leaving just a few hundred soldiers patrolling the lengthy border along the Suez Canal between Israel and Egypt, because why ruin a bunch of people's holiday when there's absolutely no chance they'll be needed? So in the couple of hours before all-out war broke out, suddenly the intelligence assessments changed, but it was far too late to do anything about it, leading to some senior government ministers in the first hours of the war saying the third temple is falling. Of course, there isn't a third temple, but we think about the first temple of Jerusalem, the second temple of Jerusalem, the Jewish kingdoms that existed around them. And in some people's eyes and in some people's use of flowery language, the state of Israel, established in 1948, was akin to the third temple. Some were saying the third temple is falling. And indeed, in those first few hours of the war on the northern front in the Golan Heights, on the southern front at the western edge of the Sinai Peninsula, it literally seemed that Israel was destined to be destroyed, to being overrun. Now, we all know, because obviously Israel wasn't overrun, we know to whatever degree of detail that the story turned. Israel's turned the tide, and nearly 3 weeks later, when the ceasefires that were moderated by the Americans were implemented, Israel had survived, and Israel had acquitted itself very respectably. And with that, we're going to move 50 years forward. Lots more to be said about that potential, or the interpretations of that perceived victory by the Arab world. If you define victory as being something better than outright humiliating defeat, which is what the Arabs had suffered in 1948, in 1956, in 1967, this better outcome from the Arab world perspective likely paved the way just a few short years later to the Arab country normalizing relations with Israel, dropping its war against Israel. I'm speaking, of course, about the peace treaty that was negotiated and signed between Israel and Egypt in the late 1970s. Fast forward. Over the last couple of weeks, a lot of the articles and the TV talking heads in Israel talking about the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, they were talking extensively about the humiliating start, the desperate lack of preparedness. And one of the questions that was prevalent in all of these articles and in all of these studio interviews, could Israel ever be caught unawares again? And on Friday, as it happens, I was watching a program on I-24 News. There were three military experts. One of them, some of you may be familiar with, former head of military intelligence, actually with family roots here in Chicago, Miri Eisen. And Miri, among the others, said, in response to the question, could Israel ever be caught unprepared like that again? Miri said something along the lines of, I would never say never, but the lessons have been learned. That was Friday. Friday night, my wife and I were at Shabbat dinner with family. We came home. It was about 10:30 at night. We called relatives in Israel. We had some medical things. We were home. My father-in-law said to us, I didn't expect to start the day with rockets and sirens. It was about 6:45 a.m. in Israel on Saturday. We said, oh, it's probably nothing, because literally for the last 17 years, Israelis have gotten used to rockets, mortars, and missiles being launched from the Hamas-run Gaza Strip into targets, or really lack of targets, all around southern Israel. My in-laws live in a moshav that is 45 minutes, perhaps, from the edge of the Gaza Strip. Usually they're out of range. Every now and again, they get sirens, to the point that a couple of years ago, they did build a safe room in their house, which had never had one up until then. My father-in-law said, I didn't think the day was going to start with sirens and rockets, and we almost poo-pooed it. Except we kept hearing when we were on the phone with him, and then we tuned into Israeli radio and TV, and we were hearing alerts about rockets, mortars, and missiles being launched with a frequency that I do not ever remember. It became very clear very quickly that this was not just another episode in what has seemed like a never-ending episode of Gaza taunting Israel. I'm going to share just a couple of maps just to make sure everybody is looking at and thinking about the same spaces. Here's just a pretty ordinary map that I assume you're all familiar with, a map of Israel. We see the West Bank noted. We see the Gaza Strip noted. Gaza Strip is a tiny place. Whatever you may think about it, it is 141 square miles. It's about 25 miles long from north to south, hugging the Mediterranean coastline, with Israel on two sides, the north and the east side, Egypt on the west side over here, and the Mediterranean Sea on the far west side. 25 miles long. It ranges from 3.5 miles wide to 7.5 miles wide. Let's zoom in and just take a little bit better look at what we're talking about. So on this map, the red or the pink is the Gaza Strip. We'll talk in a moment about the blue or purple shaded area. Just for the sake of continuing this conversation, my in-laws Moshav is a little bit off of this map. If you can still see where my cursor is, it's around here, near Yavne, near Rehovot, for those of you familiar with the geography of the area and the 10, 15 miles south of Tel Aviv. Like I said, Israelis have grown accustomed to rockets, mortars, and missiles being launched from Gaza at targets in Israel, primarily bearing the largest brunt, the communities in what is called the Gaza envelope, the area hugging the Gaza Strip, made up of moshavim and kibbutzim, small, sometimes agriculturally focused communities, and Sderot up here, the largest community near Gaza with a population of about 30,000. Some of you, if you've been on community trips to Israel over the past decade or so, you very likely have visited Sderot. If you happen to be in Israel on a trip organized by or in coordination with the Jewish National Fund, you almost certainly visited the indoor playground in Sderot, built through donations from JNF, a giant indoor playground that really looks and feels and operates like an outdoor playground, except it is built inside a reinforced concrete box, meaning that at moments of particularly high stress, kids can be in the playground playing and they're safe. Everything I said in these last 2 minutes is completely absurd and abnormal. And perhaps the most absurd and abnormal part of it is that since 2007, when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, it's become perfectly normal. And it's become a daily part of expected Israeli life that rockets, mortars, and missiles are launched from Gaza, that sirens go off. And if you live in the area just across the border from Gaza, when a siren goes off, you've got 7 seconds to get to a safe place. If you live further away, if you live in Tel Aviv or north of Tel Aviv, you've got more like 60 or 90 seconds. Even that, you have 60 seconds. You're in the shower. The baby is taking a nap. You have 60 seconds to get out of the shower, maybe dry yourself off, not slip and break your neck, grab the baby, rush to the safe room or to the bomb shelter, which may or may not actually be in your home, secure the door, and wait to hear the boom. That has become perfectly normal in Israel. So when we spoke to my father-in-law late Friday night, Chicago time, early Saturday morning, Israel time, and he said I didn't expect the day to start with sirens and rockets, none of us were too excited. We all turned on the radio to hear the news updates, and what we heard was shocking. So shocking that it took me a lot of time before these ideas, these thoughts started to crystallize, and I started to be able to wrap my head around what I was hearing, because we were hearing about pickup trucks with armed Hamas fighters roaming the streets of Sderot in Israel. A huge part of Israel's security doctrine for decades has been making it essentially impossible for people who want to bring harm to Israelis to get anywhere near Israelis. After one of the recent Gaza episodes, the government spent something in the range of $1 billion to fortify the fence separating Israel from Gaza. We're not talking about an ordinary chain link fence or a picket fence or anything else. We're talking about an incredibly sophisticated piece of technology, with sensors. I saw somebody say this fence is so sophisticated that if a feather floats across it, a dozen soldiers are notified immediately and they stop that feather. How was it possible on Saturday morning that pickup trucks filled with machine gun toting Hamas terrorists are roaming the streets of Sderot and a growing number of the kibbutzim that you see in this purple area on this map? It took time until we figured out, until the news reports started to clarify that literally hundreds of Hamas fighters had overrun the sparse IDF patrols along parts of the fence at the main crossing into Israel, where Palestinian workers who are authorized to work in Israel go through stringent security every morning as they're on their way to work and as they're on their way back home at the end of the workday. Hamas fighters overran these positions. Now, I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but just keep this map in mind as we continue this conversation. It became very clear very quickly that what was going on was very, very different, than anything we had seen before. Those parallels to the Yom Kippur War 50 years and one day earlier suddenly would not leave my head. In a lot of ways, what's going on right now has nothing to do with the Yom Kippur War precedent. And in other ways, it seems to have everything to do. In what ways does it have nothing to do with what's going on now and 50 years ago? Hamas does not pose an existential threat to the state of Israel. There are no government ministers or military officials saying this is the end of the state of Israel. Hamas has a tremendous ability to disrupt life in Israel for Israelis with its indiscriminate use of military might, trying to inflict harm and trying to instill terror among nearly 10 million Israelis. Hamas, with its pickup trucks and machine guns and rockets, mortars, and missiles, does not have the ability to even pose the tiniest threat to the existence of the state of Israel. In 1973, the very real fear, especially in those first hours and days, was that the coordinated, sophisticated, well-planned onslaught waged by Egypt and Syria together could lead to the elimination of the state of Israel. I'm being told right now that there is a wave of rocket sirens, of warning sirens in much of the area around Gaza, leading up north to the Tel Aviv area, while the number of rockets, which is estimated at 5,000, lobbed yesterday alone, the number of rockets, missiles, and mortars being lobbed into Israel from Gaza is way down from what it was at the peak hours yesterday. Rounds of sirens, warnings, and all the rest continue through today. After a day like yesterday, when the sirens were literally going off one after the other, and you didn't have time to leave your safe room before you got another warning that you had to go back into your safe room, and hundreds of thousands of people just said, to hell with it, we're not going out. Today, they're relatively infrequent, but think about it. If any of you had to rush to a safe room in your basement once a day, once a month, once a year, not because of a tornado warning, but because somebody was literally trying to arbitrarily kill you, that once a year would not seem like it was reasonable and limited in scope. That's the reality here. What became very clear very quickly yesterday, and like I said, it just was hard for me and for a lot of other people to wrap our heads around it, the thousands of projectiles being launched from Gaza into Israel, most of which, of course, were intercepted by Iron Dome, the anti-missile technology that Israel, together with the US, developed over the past dozen or so years. Most of them were intercepted, though the number of rockets and missiles coming in these incessant volleys, it wasn't possible. There aren't enough batteries of Iron Dome to intercept all of them, and there were direct hits on houses and on other facilities. There were Israelis who died because of rockets and missiles being launched, but it became very clear very quickly that the rockets and the missiles, perhaps for the first time, were essentially a diversionary tactic. As Hamas fighters, as noted, in pickup trucks, on foot, on mopeds and motorcycles, crashed through the border fence, crashed through the border crossing, and hundreds of them infiltrated into Israel, destroying that protocol that says the best way to protect Israeli civilians is to make it impossible for people who want to bring them harm to get anywhere near them. Throughout much of the day yesterday, there were Hamas terrorists in nearly 24 communities near Gaza, as far as more than 10 miles away from Gaza, but with the largest concentration of attacks taking place literally just across the border. Now, you all know, of course, Friday night and Saturday, in addition to being Shabbat, was Simchat Torah, the end of the high holiday season. And on Simchat Torah, among the many other activities planned in Israel, there was a massive nature concert taking place in the desert, not far from the Gaza Strip, with thousands of young people and trance music. That, don't ask me about trance music. I'm not their target audience, and I'm going to assume that none of you are either. But there were thousands of young people camping out in the desert, doing whatever it is that you do at an overnight, day and a half long trance music festival, where you're camping and you're drinking and you're smoking and you're listening to music and whatever else you're doing. And clearly, Hamas knew this was happening. And they were firing on the crowds, and they were chasing after people who were trying to flee. And just today, a couple hours ago, when the IDF released revised numbers of casualties, yesterday in the middle of the day, they were talking about at least 22 Israelis are dead. We all looked at each other and nodded knowingly and said, oh, it's going to be much worse than that. Pretty soon those numbers were at 100. And then they were at 200. And this morning they were at 300. And a couple hours ago, they were revised upwards to 600. Because as search and recovery teams were combing the area where the concert took place, they found scores and scores of additional bodies that had not been in the body count. There are harrowing stories from kibbutzim in the area, from kibbutz Be'eri, from kibbutz Nachal Oz, from kibbutz Kfar Aza, which is still at this moment as we speak under siege. And some of the reports that are circulating, all of them at this point unverified and unconfirmed, indicate that in Kfar Aza there are nearly no survivors. This is a community of hundreds that 2 days ago was an idyllic frontier community. Today, the word that's circulating is that almost everyone is either dead or has been kidnapped. Excuse security establishment just released a few minutes before we began this session an acknowledgement that well over 100 and perhaps as many as 170 Israelis, most of them civilians, have been kidnapped by Hamas and spirited into hiding places in the Gaza Strip. Hamas was gleefully yesterday posting on social media photos and videos of bloodied and beaten Israelis, everybody from small children to teenagers, to men and women, to elderly, bleeding, limping, being shoved around forcefully, shoved into the backs of jeeps, brought to Gaza, where they were paraded through streets and subjected to humiliation. That humiliation is nothing compared to the threat that this poses when Hamas is in possession, as you probably remember from over a decade ago, of one IDF soldier, Gilad Shalit. The entire country comes together praying for, hoping for, negotiating for the safe return of that one hostage. Gilad Shalit, after being held in Hamas captivity for 5 years, was finally released in a prisoner exchange in which well over 1,000 Palestinian security prisoners, including, I want to say hundreds, who were serving life sentences in Israeli jails for murder, were released in order to bring home one IDF soldier who had been captured. Imagine what's going through the minds of nearly 10 million Israelis. And this is without even talking about the immediate family members and the loved ones of those 100 to 170 Israeli civilians and soldiers being held captive by Hamas as bargaining chips for we can only begin to guess what. Well over 2,000 Israelis have been injured. As noted, the current number of casualties of dead is put at 600, given that Kfar Aza is still under terror occupation, given that the reports we're hearing and the anecdotal stories we're hearing point to horrible, horrible fights, attacks, literal executions, we have to assume that that 600 number is going to grow. All of this leads to those inevitable questions. Is this Yom Kippur all over again? Clearly, in terms of the intelligence failure, this is Yom Kippur all over again. In terms, as I noted, of an existential threat, which the Yom Kippur War did pose to Israel, Hamas does not pose an existential threat to the state of Israel. Even if it emerges that yesterday was the single day in Israel's history with the most casualties among Israeli soldiers and civilians, and I haven't put my hands on the numbers, but I'm certain that yesterday will go down in history that way. Hamas does not pose an existential threat to the state of Israel. When the head of the military wing of Hamas yesterday issued calls to Arab citizens of Israel to take to the streets and join the fight, when he issued calls to all of the Arab nations to join the fight and wage war on Israel, none of them did. Yes, you can go on the internet and you can find scenes in Syria, in Egypt, in Turkey, in many places around the Arab and the Muslim world of parades and celebration that Hamas has humiliated the Israelis. We've not seen any indication that any Arab or Muslim government is going to step in, with, of course, the exception of Iran, which is widely surmised to have played a key role in arming and helping in the planning of yesterday's onslaught. Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Ra'am political party in Israel, that party supported by Arab citizens of Israel, primarily religious Muslims, the party that 2 years ago joined the Bennett-Lapid government, becoming the first Arab majority party ever to join a governing coalition in the state of Israel. Mansour Abbas issued statements yesterday calling on Arab citizens of Israel to ignore any calls to take to the streets. He called on them to continue abiding by the law. He called on them and on Jewish Israelis to do everything in their power to maintain peace and quiet and to strive for a return to normalcy. We've not seen any leaders of the Arab community in Israel we haven't seen other Arab leaders coming out with similar statements, but we also have not seen any Arab leaders come out with different presentations or with different messages urging. We've not seen leaders in the Arab community in Israel calling on Arab citizens of Israel to take to the streets in solidarity with Hamas. We're right in the thick of this. While yesterday's level of violence and of horror seems unlikely to be repeated in the coming days, this is nowhere near finished. The cabinet has already taken the pretty extraordinary step of declaring that this is a war that opens the possibility of responses. Up till now, the Israeli Air Force has been targeting Hamas and Islamic Jihad military installations in the Gaza Strip, doing so aggressively, using some of the tactics that it's developed to a lot of international criticism over the years, warning residents of buildings, we are going after the Hamas installation in the basement, so we suggest you get out and you have this many minutes to do it. They do this by dropping thousands of flyers on the buildings. They do this by a process called knocking, where they make knocking noises on the roof of the building, drawing attention so people see the flyers, so they have the opportunity to leave. Of course, when you have Hamas terrorists standing at the entrance and the exit of the building, telling civilians, if you leave, we will shoot you, it puts them in an awful position, because Hamas has shown for years, not only do they have no regard for Israeli lives, they have very little regard for Palestinian lives either. The prospect of a ground invasion, which on the one hand would allow the IDF to carry out much more precisely targeted attacks on Hamas and Islamic Jihad centers of power, also brings with it inevitably a much higher toll in terms of IDF casualties than does an air attack, regardless of how long and how sustained the planes, the helicopters, and the drones are that are being sent over the skies of Gaza. We don't know where any of this will lead. Like I said at the start, wouldn't it have been wonderful if your regularly scheduled speaker could have been here and talked with you about the government's plans and efforts to reform the judicial system in Israel? If he'd been able to unpack with you the balance of power and the different branches of government in Israel, and what's similar to the US and what's different from the US, and what it means that Israel has the most right-wing government it's ever had before, and how that's impacting the stories that are playing out. All of that seems so very far away right now. The protest rallies that have taken place, the largest, of course, on Kaplan Street in downtown Tel Aviv, which in the last 35, 30 36 weeks, right around this time, because it is, after all, 8 hours later in Israel. It's almost 7 p.m. on Saturday night in Israel. And that's around the time that those crowds, more than 100,000 most weekends, sometimes 200,000, have been gathering. They will not be gathering tonight. In times of war, Israelis come together. It doesn't mean that all of the disagreements that have colored the Israeli conversation since January, or truly with other parameters far before January, it doesn't mean that those debates and those discussions and those disagreements no longer matter. It means that when Israel is under a horrific, terrifying external threat, Israelis come together. The leader of the political opposition, Yair Lapid, the chair of the Yesh Atid party, came out yesterday after a briefing, a security briefing that the prime minister gave him, as is supposed to happen between the prime minister and the leader of the parliamentary opposition on a regular basis. Lapid, in that meeting, said to Mr. Netanyahu, we will join an emergency unity coalition in order to fight this together. And he said, I am all but certain that Benny Gantz, the leader of the second largest opposition party, the National Unity Party, said, I'm all but certain that he would join too. Now, this is not a no strings attached offer. Lapid said, and then he repeated in a public statement to the media, we will join a narrow, professional, unity emergency government in order to deal with these very challenging times. And we will do so once the most extreme elements in the current government are removed. A reference, of course, to the Religious Zionism Party and the Jewish Power Party, led respectively by Bezalel Smotrich and by Itamar Ben-Gvir. Smotrich, of course, serving today in the cabinet as the Minister of Finance and as a minister in the Defense Ministry, Ben-Gvir serving as the National Security Minister. Now, if all these events of the last 36 hours had not happened, you'd be talking now about who are these people? Why is it so striking that they are holding such important positions in the government of Israel? We're not going to talk about that today. Suffice to say that if they stay in their roles and the current government continues to be the government that is navigating this new, unexpected, and uncharted reality, there's a lot of concern, not only among opponents of this government, but among a lot of people who voted for the parties that make up this government. There's a lot of concern that the considerations that will be brought to the decision-making forums will miss the boat, will miss the point on so many aspects of what Israel needs to navigate here. Some already, and I've spent much of this morning thinking about what positive note might I end on. And I'm going to be very upfront with you and tell you, it's a stretch. It's a stretch. But as I've said for years, the day we stop believing that there can be a better future for Israel, the day we stop believing that there's no possibility of peace for Israel in the region, the day we stop believing, the day we stop holding on to the hope that that day will come, that will be a very sad day indeed. So some of the pundits already are saying, whatever else we learn about the comparison to 50 years ago in the Yom Kippur War, let's not forget that the Yom Kippur War ultimately paved the way to the first Arab country recognizing Israel's right to exist, signing a peace treaty with Israel. And not just any Arab country, but Egypt, the largest, most populous, most important country in the Arab world, certainly of 50 years ago, arguably today as well, but certainly 50 years ago, that would not and could not have happened. Well, we don't see how we could have gotten there without the horrifying reality of those 3 weeks in October 1973. Might it be that in some way, what we're experiencing and what we're following with such horror and such sadness and such shock today, might it be possible that in some way that we can't yet discern, these events will pave the way to a better future? Until someone proves to me otherwise, and that may well happen, I'm holding on to that hope. And I hope that all of you can as well. I'm going to stop here, and I believe that Vanessa is going to moderate some questions, and I look forward to hearing what's on your mind and seeing what I might be able to share and respond.
We're going to go to Alan and Carol Green, whose son Richard was supposed to be here this morning. Go ahead.
So you said that Hamas is not an existential threat to Israel, but we've already heard that Hezbollah has sent rockets from Lebanon, and presumably Iran is behind all of this. What about the combination of threats, particularly with Iran, which supplies the militants in these other countries?
It's an excellent question, and one of the biggest concerns that's been on literally everyone's mind, one of the biggest concerns that's been on everyone's mind since yesterday is, what if this expands to Israel's northern front? And I will, just for a quick second, I'll share my screen once again just to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. And here, there we go. So if we've got Gaza towards the south, in the northern part of Israel, I hope you can see my cursor, this is Lebanon. Southern Lebanon has largely been taken over by Hezbollah, Arabic for the Party of God. There are tens of thousands of rockets and missiles aimed at northern Israel and central Israel from Hezbollah stations, bases of operation throughout southern Lebanon. Thus far, the concern is there. There have been some brushes between the IDF and Hezbollah at the northern border. There's been concern as there are reports that the United Nations, they call themselves the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, the UN peacekeepers who are there to try to keep the sides apart. There have been reports that many of them have been fleeing their posts over the last 24 hours. Never a good sign. The truth of the matter is, barrages of rockets and missiles pose a tremendous quality of life threat to Israel. And I don't say that to try to be flip. They do not spell the end of the state of Israel. Iran joining in, which cannot be ruled out, poses a tremendous quality of life threat to the state of Israel. It does not lead to scenarios like the scenario that was feared in 73 and feared in 67 and feared in 48 of Arab armies literally marching on Haifa, on Tel Aviv, on Beersheba, and quote unquote driving the Jews into the sea. I think Israel's security situation, Israel's military preparedness, even though it has not been shown in a very good light over the last day and a half, but Israel's military capabilities, Israel's global alliances make today very different than those days of grave threat, existential threat 50 years ago and earlier.
We have a question in the chat from Floyd. Today's world of surveillance includes drones, satellites, and other high-tech applications. Thus, isn't intelligence failure way worse than in 73?
I'm not going to directly answer the question. The intelligence failure is severe. There will be a commission of inquiry, as there was after the 1973 debacle. There will be a commission of inquiry to try to figure out what happened. Now, here's something interesting for all of us to try to process. Back in 73, when, yes, most intelligence was based on human intelligence, the intelligence services were providing reports that indicated great threat and rumblings of the possibility of war. The leaders of the army and the country's political leaders chose to discount those reports. So the intelligence failure was in the failure to internalize the significance of the intelligence warnings. That was in 73. We don't yet have any reason to believe, though it may come out that there were things, but we've not been given any reason to believe that there were similar reports filed in recent weeks or months pointing to the intention of Hamas to wage this kind of war. As recently as last week, it was observed from the Israeli side of the border that Hamas was engaged in all kinds of military exercises near the border. Remember, Gaza is 3.5 to 7.5 miles wide. Nothing is far from the border. The Israelis were watching these operations. What we're being told today, and maybe there's another level of truth that may or may not come out in the Commission of Inquiry, which has not even yet been created. But what we're being told is that the assessment by Israel's military intelligence and others was that Hamas was carrying out these exercises to intimidate the Israelis, and that Hamas had no interest in waging war. We're being told that the fact that Qatar, which over the years has given more than $1 billion of aid to Hamas to run the Gaza Strip, and the Qataris have always made it a condition of their financial aid that Hamas keep things quiet in Gaza. We're being, and the Israelis have always made it a condition of allowing Palestinians from Gaza to come into Israel to work and bring shekels home to support their families and the Palestinian economy in Gaza. And the Israelis have always made the allowing Palestinians into Israel to work, they've always made that conditional on things being quiet in Gaza. So the concept embraced by the political and military echelons in Israel for years has been that Hamas wants to keep things quiet. And yes, they'll shoot some rockets, and yes, they'll wave their swords and make a lot of noise, but they don't want to do anything to interrupt the flow of the cash that they need in order to provide the services that they need to provide in Gaza. Therefore, they can't piss off the Israelis too much, and they can't piss off the Qataris too much. Perhaps what ultimately will go down as what makes this particular round of intelligence failure worse is what looks like right now failure of the intelligence agencies to even identify a threat and to bring it to the attention of the security establishment and the political establishment. The one last thing I would say about all the high-tech surveillance, and this is not based only on Israel, this is based on US intelligence when we look to Afghanistan and Iraq and other places around the world, for all the value of drones and various satellites and all kinds of electronic whatever, anyone who decides that they're going to rely on technology rather than on human intelligence does so at their peril.
Very interesting. We have a lot of questions coming in. And Carl, can we go a little longer after 11?
We can go a little longer after 11.
Great. I also want to put in the chat, if you're looking for different news sources besides CNN and Alan and Carol, CNN, of course, is our preferred, especially from Jerusalem, with Richard there. But here's some other Ynet News, Haaretz, which is the daily newspaper there. Sarah, you have your hand up, and then I'll read some questions from the chat.
About the possible coalition with the more moderate groups as an emergency coalition to fight this war. They made the conditions which you described, which were very interesting. What status is this? Has it been accepted, or is it in the negotiation?
It's an excellent question. The honest answer is, I can tell you what's being said publicly. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. A few hours after Mr. Lapid made his public appeal, which, as I noted, came after he made the same appeal directly to Netanyahu in a face-to-face meeting, the Likud party issued a statement saying, we don't talk about politics in a time of war, seeming to say, not gonna happen. Media are full of reports that Mr. Netanyahu, Mr. Lapid, and Mr. Gantz have met today. What does any of it mean? We don't know. The likelihood of Mr. Netanyahu firing his two far-right ministers and all the other ministers and portfolio holders from their parties on a lot of levels seems unlikely. This coalition has provided Mr. Netanyahu the security that he needs in order to rule. Firing them and bringing in two parties that oppose him on many issues and on loads of other grounds potentially makes him vulnerable once the immediate crisis has passed. What if his government falls? What if new elections are called? Polls for months have indicated that the parties that make up the current coalition would suffer a tremendous defeat and a loss of a lot of their support if elections were held now. I would suggest that this is a potential watershed moment where the test for Mr. Netanyahu is whether he's putting party first, individual needs first, or the good of the country first. And we'll have to wait and see how that plays out over the coming days.
From Len, if Israel eliminates Hamas from Gaza, what will it be replaced with?
Israel has for years embraced I'll call it a fantasy, of being able to eliminate Hamas from Gaza. It just ain't that easy. For decades, Israel has been targeting the leaders of Hamas in targeted assassinations, very controversial around a lot of the world. I'm not crazy about targeted assassinations, not because of the moral concerns, and I'll leave that for others. I'm not crazy about targeted assassination of terror leaders because what we've seen over the decades is that one gets killed and another one takes his place. That one gets killed and another one takes his place. There is tremendous deep-seated opposition to any notion of accepting Israel's right to exist. I don't know how you decide to eliminate that. Bret Stephens, writing in the New York Times today, posits that there may be an intersection of interests between Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the US, whereby Hamas is eliminated from power. The Saudis and the Emiratis pour so many billions of dollars into state building in Gaza that Gazans turn away from Hamas and their extremism and their rejectionism. It's a wonderful 5 minutes if you let yourself get caught up in the scenario that he posits. I can't help but feeling like we've seen this movie before. And when people ask me, and nobody's asked me, but I'm going to presume that maybe somebody's wondering, when people ask me, what is the biggest obstacle to bringing about an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with all of the challenges that exist between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, which rules in the West Bank, and there are huge challenges there. The Palestinian Authority, in word and in deed, has committed to accepting the existence of Israel. Not without a lot of caveats, not without a lot of exceptions, not without a lot of pushback, but it has accepted the reality of Israel and the reality of living side by side with Israel. Hamas has done no such thing. Hamas has refused to accept the Oslo Accords. Hamas has refused to recognize Israel's right to exist. And in case we needed any reminder, these last 2 days provide it. Hamas has steadfastly refused to reject terror as a legitimate tool of their so-called resistance. Because going into a kibbutz and gathering people, men, women, children, into the dining room and machine gunning hordes of them, and going to a rock concert and grabbing young people and beating them bloody and dragging them across the border and putting them in a basement somewhere to use them as a bargaining chip, that's terrorism. That's not a military operation. And as long as the sentiments that have powered Hamas for decades aren't addressed, I don't see how that resolution comes. Now, remember, I said a few minutes ago, I won't let go of my optimism that someday the circumstances will change. Right now, I don't see how we get there. And frankly, the notion of eliminating Hamas seems like a fairy tale. I don't see how it happens.
From Carol and Ellen, Richard's parents, is there any reason to think Hamas would send rockets to Jerusalem? They wouldn't want to destroy their holy sites, right? Isn't that right?
Friends of mine in Jerusalem ran to their safe rooms 7 times yesterday when there were 7 sirens in their neighborhood. 2 years ago, the events of May 2021 started with Hamas sending missiles towards Jerusalem. One more example of the cynicism of the military and political leaders of Hamas. For all of the importance of their holy sites, yes, they do seem perfectly willing to send very poorly equipped in terms of their radar and accuracy projectiles. They seem perfectly willing to aim those at Jerusalem. Just as the irony can't be missed when we look at the number of Muslims who seem to, from what we're gathering so far, be among those minimum of 600 dead citizens of Israel. Hamas apparently doesn't discriminate and has no problem indiscriminately targeting Muslims whose mortal sin is that they live in the state of Israel.
I don't know if you can wrap these two together, but Do you see any connection between this attack and the recent talks between Netanyahu and the Saudis? And I have to find it. And what about the connection to the Speaker of the House?
Oh,
Is there a parallel?
Okay. To the first one, absolutely. To the second one, I'll think about that as I answer on the first one.
Okay.
The growing winds that seem to be indicating that it is not beyond the realm of possible that Saudi Arabia will normalize relations with Israel. Saudi Arabia is not in a state of war with Israel, so it's not a matter of signing a peace treaty. It's mutually recognizing each other and establishing diplomatic and other relations. It's been off the table for 75 years. The Abraham Accords of a little over 3 years ago seem to bring a wind of change with the notion that maybe Israel can become an accepted member of the community in the region, in the geographic part of the world that it lives in the Middle East. And the notion that had long been held throughout the Arab world that Arab countries won't normalize relations with Israel until the Palestinian question is resolved. The first chink in that argument came in 1979 with the signing of the Camp David Accords establishing peace between Israel and Egypt. 1994, Jordan joined in that way. And in 2000, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, later Sudan, though whatever, and Morocco joined in, seemingly indicating that much of the Arab world is tired of waiting for the Palestinians to do a deal. Now, it's not the time or the place to get into the question of have the offers made by Israel been sincere? Were they ever good enough? I'll simply take you back to Camp David, summer of 2000, over 23 years ago, when President Clinton convened the Israeli Prime Minister and the President of the Palestinian Authority, and the Israeli Prime Minister put an offer of an independent Palestinian state on the table. It was the first time an Israeli Prime Minister had ever done that. I'm not saying the offer was beautiful, and I'm not saying it was perfect. But the leader of the Palestinian Authority said no and didn't make a counteroffer. He did not respond. He did not step up to do a deal. And the reports from the time of the very senior member of the Saudi royal family, Prince Bandar, who at the time for many years had been the Saudi ambassador to Washington, the reports of him taking a walk with Yasser Arafat, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and saying to him, you have to take this offer. It's the best you're going to get, and it's good enough. And Arafat refusing, and Prince Bandar just calling him all kinds of names and stalking off in frustration. So the possibility that the Saudis might be ready to normalize relations with Israel, even without the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, seems fantastical. Of course, the reality is that if the Saudis are going to get all they're demanding, including a mutual defense treaty with the US, which requires ratification by 2/3 of the members of the Senate, which means that Republicans and Democrats in the narrowly divided Senate need to vote in favor of that mutual defense pact. And there are many Democratic members of the Senate who are not going to vote for a mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia, and certainly not without serious concessions to the Palestinians included in the deal. Back in Jerusalem, look at the makeup of Prime Minister Netanyahu's government. He's got parties in the government saying, we'd love to have normal relations with the Saudis. The Palestinians have nothing to do with it. We will vote against any concessions to the Palestinians. So the path to Israel-Saudi normalization, as much as we love to think about it, and as exciting as it's been in the last couple of weeks to see 2 ministers of the State of Israel government participating in conferences in Saudi Arabia, the likelihood that normalization was going to happen even before these events seemed very low. But the likelihood, as long as there's even a tiny chance of normalization happening, that's not good for Hamas. And Hamas, in much the way that it's done for decades, every time it sees potential progress on a diplomatic front that it doesn't like, it uses its doomsday power to derail whatever that progress is by engaging in terror. It is really hard to imagine any of the sides moving forward on Israeli-Saudi normalization in light of what is clearly going to be a prolonged Israeli military effort in response to the events of the last 2 days. In terms of the chaos in the House of Representatives, all that I can say is we do said the parallel that I would see, and if I thought about it more, I might come up with more. I might even question what I'm about to say now. But the parallel that I see is that in a closely divided society, which the state of Israel is, remember the parties in the coalition got less than 1% more votes than the parties that are in the opposition. So talking about a very narrow margin in Israel. And of course, the House of Representatives has a slim, bare Republican majority. In closely divided realities, extremists exercise undue weight. They have undue influence. We saw a group of 7 members of Congress inflict the ire and the disdain and the downright anger of the overwhelming majority of their party colleagues when they brought the House of Representatives to its knees. And we have seen over the past 9 months in Israel, a very small majority, the representatives of a very small majority, a very small minority of the public, guide with undue influence the direction of the government of Israel's policy choices. That would be the similarity I would see there.
Well, we could go on. Schubert's, I hope that answered your question. I do want to put in the chat, where can we donate? We certainly say Magen David Adom. They're going to be at Makom Salel Lakeside in a couple of weeks. We helped send an ambulance and they need donations now. Jewish United Fund also has an emergency link to send money to Israel. I also think that it's important to put a face on this. And when we go to Owen Saying Ruby Union Institute, there's a lot of shlichim, a lot of people from Israel. And here's Franco. He's got his Azrui hat. He was called up. And this is the face of the war. I said I'd try to keep it together. Anyway, I think at this point, I know that Rabbi Sarat is here, and Rabbi Sarat, if you want to jump in, the other thing that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention is I have to bring it up that when we go to pray every morning, we chant Nisim B'Kol Yom, and these are the miracles of every day. And we have right in our prayer book, I have to come down here, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim. Praise to you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who frees the captive. And we've got to think about that now. So that can be in our prayers. Thank you, Len. Rabbi.
Yes, can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So first, I just want to thank Carl Schrag for jumping in here this morning. We really appreciate your time and coming to help clarify these things. I only heard the last part because I was with our religious school students this morning. So So we read a prayer for the state of Israel and sang Hatikva all together in our sanctuary this morning at the start of religious school. So I hope that, and I know that you said prayers here as well at the beginning of the conversation. So our continued prayers, our continued support, our love for friends and family who are in difficult circumstances there, including our own the Valentine family. Fletcher has been called up and he's serving in the north at the moment, for those of you who know the family. And so at the moment, seemingly out of harm's way, but we'll see what the next few days bring. But our thoughts are with all of those who are dealing with this, and our prayers for hope and healing and a lasting peace from a difficult situation. Those will be with us in the days to come. So we'll continue to send out announcements from the congregation as well. And of course, Rabbi Moffick and I are available for questions and thoughts and anything anybody wants to talk about in the next few days. So
I mentioned that at the top of our morning that you're available. I would be remiss. It's totally next week we'll meet in person, and we're talking of Cantor Jay and Susan Benjamin will be giving us a look at Neil Diamond, the Hitman. Quite the different thing, but if you need anything, watch. I'm sure we're going to be. Unfortunately, I think this is going to be with us for a couple of weeks. So we will be here for you. And Jim, you got a lot of kudos in the chat, Carl, and thank you everybody for staying on, and we're thinking of Israel. All right, we'll see you next week at Shul. Bye. Thank you, Carl. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.